All right, former President Donald Trump picking his vice president, Ohio Senator and former venture capitalist JD Vance. Wall Street already beginning to weigh in, with Cowen analyst John Miller predicting that the VP nominee is going to focus his campaigning on industrial policy and anti-China trade proposals. Here to discuss this, Kim Wallace, he's 22V Research Senior Managing Director. Kim, we were just talking about with Jose Rasco here in our last segment, what matters more for the market, the election or the Fed. He's saying the Fed, but when it comes to the election, now that former President Donald Trump does have a VP pick, what do investors need to keep in mind just in terms of what exactly JD Vance could signal here for investors were Trump to be elected in November?
I think Jose nailed it, but to answer your question, what it signals is consolidation of MAGA power within the GOP. If this ticket is elected, the question of whether or not traditional conservative Republicans would eke out space for themselves is over. In the sense of the national campaign, it could become competitive again, but public sentiment, the preponderance of public sentiment indicates it won't be competitive with President Biden at the top of the Democrats' ticket.
I want to zero in on the JD Vance of it all and what we saw at the RNC yesterday, the Teamsters ahead kind of really being clearly anti-big business. We have reports that when he talked about corruption and big corporations, there was kind of this tepid silence over the room here. In terms of the JD Vance of it all, is he pro-business?
I think Senator Vance's positions on free market trade are malleable, and that's demonstrated in change in some wholesale political and policy positions in the last 3 years from the person he was, at least in politics and in business, the decade before that. So I can understand why the convention hall may have been a bit confused, but again, I don't think many of the delegates in Milwaukee are concerned about who will run policy if Trump is reelected to the White House. JD Vance will be at the table, I would assume, but certainly it'll be President Trump deciding what policy is.
Kim, I want to ask you about the big, I guess, deep-pocketed donors. We have Elon Musk. There's a report out from Wall Street Journal saying that he's going to donate to a pro-Trump campaign or a PAC that's helping to get Trump reelected here. $45 million per month in donations. Do you see this significantly swaying the election? And our columnist Rick Newman making the argument that, hey, maybe this could actually favor Biden in the long run because it shows maybe this disconnect between Main Street and Wall Street. What do you think?
I think it's possible, but first you have to get back to a competitive footing on the campaign. That's job number one, so that voters are not focused on the downside of reelecting the Biden-Harris campaign, as clearly is sentiment in all of the major polls, the preponderance of that evidence anyway. In terms of the billionaires rallying behind the former President Trump, that's voting with your dollars. That's part of democracy, and certainly part of democracy since Supreme Court decisions going back to 2010 and 2014. For Democrats, they have donors that make this race competitive. You've heard some of those donors pull back, concerned about the viability of the ticket as it stands now. So I don't think money in U.S. politics is ever going to be a determinative factor, simply because there's way too much, there are many avenues for money to find its way into U.S. politics. The question is, does it sway, in my view, does it sway the policy agenda favored by the billionaires? And it's not just Musk, it's a long list of billionaires in the last 2 months who have profess their fealty to the former president. I would say that in the NPR PBS News Marist poll from Friday, I was struck by the fact the gap between people earning $50,000 or less, 24% saying they're going to vote, versus those earning more than that mark, 76%, speaks to the bifurcation of the economy and probably the opportunity that some of these billionaires see in coalescing around former President Trump early or relatively early in the process.
Do you think, Kim, that there is a policy that Biden could talk about within the campaign cycle that would garner more support from that higher income group that you just mentioned is more likely, according to one specific poll, to be voting come November?
Not so much what I think. We look at data here at 22V, and all of the data suggests that getting into the weeds of contrasting, and it's a broad contrast between President Biden and former President Trump on almost all policies outside of trade and one could say loose fiscal policy. But the difference between these men is stark. You can't get to those details. You can't motivate a base about that so long as they have the top-down view of the viability of the ticket.
Right. I guess, Kim, to be more specific, for example, yesterday we had Biden talking about proposing capping national rent increases at 5%. Is that type of policy something that is going to help him get back into the White House in November?
I would think not, in part because the proposal appeals to a slice of America and certainly a slice of the party. But again, and not to harp on it, but to talk about the plain facts, a proposal that could become policy in the event of an election outcome is highly unlikely to change the view of most respondents to public polls, and more importantly, the Democratic base up and down the ticket in the various states and districts and among donors. That's the first challenge for Democrats, is to find a way to reverse the momentum that former President Trump has enjoyed nearly all of the last 3 weeks, and the ennui, if you will, if not despondency, that has permeated many Democrats in that period.
All right, Kim Wallace, 22V Research Senior Managing Director. Thanks so much for joining us here.